For us English speakers, learning the concept of ser and estar can be really confusing. And if you're unaware of what ser and estar is, there are two different ways of saying to be in Spanish. Depending on the context, you have to use one or the other. After 4 years of learning Spanish, I still sometimes get this wrong, which does sound quite, I guess it does sound quite bad, but that's the truth of it. Sometimes I'll hear native speakers and they'll use ser when I thought they should use estar, and vice versa. So I'm still definitely learning and working on ser and estar, but I feel like over the 4 years of learning Spanish, I have developed some decent rules of thumb to help you with your Spanish. And don't get me wrong, there are still some exceptions to these rules that I'm going to cover in this video. For example, él está muerto, estamos casados, and la fiesta es en Londres. Those three, for the life of me, I can't understand why it's not the other one. But yeah, I'm going to try and touch on as many exceptions as I've found as well in this video to help you in certain examples where sometimes it just doesn't make sense in English, or it doesn't follow the general rules of thumb that I have found and learned, or I'm going to teach in this video. I know when I was learning ser and estar initially, I was taught impermanence versus permanence. So what I mean by that is ser was always used for permanent things. So for example, if you're talking about someone's personality or their appearance or the appearance of a building or describing something, generally you'd use ser for that because they are more permanent things. Someone's not going to be able to change their characteristics or their traits as a person, or generally their appearance. And the same with buildings, they're not generally going to change, they're more permanent, so therefore you would use ser. Whereas estar was used for more impermanent things, so emotions and feelings of illness that come and go. That's when you use estar. And that is a decent rule of thumb to generally use, but there are quite a few exceptions to these rules. I think too many exceptions for you to just think impermanence versus permanence when thinking of ser and estar. For example, mi casa está en Londres. If you were using the permanence versus impermanence rule, you would think it would be mi casa es en Londres, because surely my house can't move. My house is in London, and this is a permanent fact. The house is not going to be able to move. But in this example, we use estar. And that's why this permanence versus impermanence rule isn't the best way, I feel, of going about using ser and estar. Don't get me wrong, you can still use the permanence versus impermanence idea, but I think combining it with these acronyms that I'm going to give you is going to really help you increase the amount of times you're correctly using ser and estar. And by the way, I just wanted to say, if there are any native speakers watching this video, please feel free to correct me as much as possible in the comments. The more feedback I get, the better. I want to improve my Spanish as much as the people watching this video. So if I do make any mistakes, I don't want, first of all, the viewers to be wrong and me teaching something that is incorrect. And also, I don't want to be learning and knowing things that are incorrect in Spanish as well. I'm far from perfect with ser and estar and generally in Spanish. So the more feedback and corrections I get, the better. And I'd really appreciate that. Yeah, without further ado, let's crack on with the acronyms. And these two acronyms are doctor and place. So for ser, it is doctor, and for estar, it is place. Let's start off with ser and the acronym doctor. So firstly, the D in doctor stands for description. So like I said before, when you're using ser, you generally use it for descriptions. So for example, el edificio es muy grande, or es muy moderno, yo soy muy alto, things like that, that are descriptions describing someone. An exception to this rule would be estar muerto, to be dead. You don't say ser muerto. In the Spanish-speaking world, they say estar muerto. Even though this is a description and it is permanent, we use estar. That's just one to be aware of. If you're saying someone is dead, you would say está muerto. Now moving on to the first O of doctor, occupation. So when you're describing someone's profession, you would use ser. So for example, if you're saying soy profesor de matemáticas, ellos son jardineros, things like that, where you're describing someone's job, occupation, that is when you use ser. Another little tip that isn't related to ser and estar is when you're describing someone's job or occupation, don't put un or una in the phrase. So for example, yo soy profesor. We don't say yo soy un profesor. Obviously in English this doesn't make sense. We don't say I am teacher. We say I am a teacher. But in Spanish, we don't have the un or una when speaking and describing someone's occupation. The only time you use un or una when describing someone's job or occupation is when you've modified it. So for example, yo soy un muy buen profesor de matemáticas, or ellos son unos buenos jardineros, something like that, when you've modified it and then you're not just saying that they are gardeners. That is the only time you use un or una or the plural versions when talking about jobs and occupations. Yeah, that's just a little thing to be aware of that I wanted to add into this video. I might need to make a whole separate video on un and una and when not to use it, because there's certain times that Spanish people use it and don't use it, which doesn't make sense to us in English. And to be honest, I still don't get half of them, so I should probably make a whole other video on it and learn it better myself. But moving on, the C in doctor stands for characteristics. When it comes to describing someone's traits or their personality, you would also use ser. For example, él es muy amable. That's an example of describing someone's characteristics, saying he is a very kind person. That is when you'd also use ser to describe them. And next is T for time. When you're describing anything related to time, you would use ser. So for example, son las 9 por la noche, or hoy es el partido. As far as I know, you never use estar when talking about time, so just always keep it ser related. Next, we have the second oath in doctor, which stands for origin. So when you're talking about where someone is from or where you are from, you use ser. So for example, yo soy de Inglaterra, él es de Colombia, ellos son de Argentina. These are examples of you saying where someone or where you are from. Therefore, you would use ser. And finally, the last letter in the acronym doctor is R for relationships. Generally, when talking about relationships, you also use ser. So for example, somos amigos, ellos son una pareja. However, there is an example that I did mention earlier. From what I've heard and read, when talking about being married, you wouldn't say somos casados. Apparently, it sounds very, very wrong to say that. Instead, you would say estamos casados, even though this does go against the rule when talking about and describing relationships. So that's just an exception to be aware of. If you hear someone say estamos casados, that's not incorrect. That's just an exception to this rule. And now we finish the acronym doctor for ser. Let's move on to the acronym place for estar. Firstly, we have P for position. So when we're describing the position of something or ourselves, we would use estar. So for example, estoy al lado de la estación. This is an example of a position. I am next to the station. Therefore, you would use estar. And next we have L, which stands for location. This is when you're talking about literally the location of something. Londres está en Inglaterra. Mi casa está en el suroeste de Londres. Things like that. When you're describing the location of something, you pretty much always use estar. However, there is one exception, which this one I don't know why this is a thing, but I've learned recently that when you're describing events or where an event is taking place, you use ser. You do not use estar. So for everything else, when you're describing the location of something, you use estar. But when it comes to events, so fiestas, parties, things like that, anything to do with events, you would use ser. So for example, like I said before, la fiesta es en Londres, el evento es en Marruecos. I don't know. Anyway, it's always ser. And this is just another exception which I can't rationalize. I don't understand why, but you just got to sort of know and understand that when you're talking about events and the location of these events, you use ser instead of estar. But generally speaking, other than that, if you're talking about locations, you use estar. And then the A in the acronym place stands for action. So when you're using the present continuous tense, you would use estar. So for example, estoy comiendo, estoy bebiendo, ellos están jugando fútbol. When you're talking about I am playing, I am doing, I am eating, they are playing football. That is when you would always use estar. You never use ser when you're talking in the present continuous tense. Yeah, if you're talking about actions that you are currently doing, estoy grabando un video, I'm recording a video, I would never say soy grabando un video. I would never say that. So just be aware of that. If you're using the present continuous tense, it is always estar. And next we have C. C stands for conditions. So when you're describing someone's physical state, so for example, él está enfermo or estoy lesionado. Generally speaking, when you're talking about conditions and your physical state, you would use estar. And then finally, the last letter in the acronym place is E for emotion. So when you're talking about how you are feeling in that moment or how someone else is feeling, that's when you use estar. Yo estoy muy cansado or él está muy contento, something like that. When you're talking about someone's emotions in that moment, that is when you use estar. That is the acronyms doctor and place covered. Now let's do a little quiz to see how much you've learned from this video. First of all, let's look at the phrase el blank muy enojado. Depending on whether you use es or está, it's going to completely change the meaning of this sentence. Because as I said before, if we put él es muy enojado, what this is going to mean is he is a very angry person. Whereas if we say él está muy enojado, that's going to mean he is very angry in this moment. He's just feeling angry right now. So just be careful with that differentiation between the two, because obviously that sentence can easily be interchanged between es and está, but it's going to completely change what that sentence means. So be very careful which one you're using in which context. Another example of this would be él está borracho or él es un borracho. So borracho means drunk. And again, this is another way that this sentence can change quite drastically, because if you say él está borracho, he is just drunk. He is drunk right now. Whereas if you say él es un borracho, he is a drunk. He is someone who is sort of an alcoholic or someone who's always drinking and drunk. And again, yeah, that's another way of just being careful when to use one and when to use the other, because that can drastically change, as I've said, the meaning of the sentence. I hope this video has helped you to learn how to use ser and estar more effectively. And if you are looking at wanting to improve your Spanish at a faster rate, you can book a call with me to discuss how you could fit into my one-to-one coaching program. And right now I'm doing a month free just because I'm getting up and running and I want to improve my ability to coach people. So therefore, if you just book a call with me, we can discuss where your level is at. From there, I can just give you a month of free coaching. Let me know if you want to do that. And there's a link in the description of this video to book a call with me if you want to do that. And if you are looking to do some quizzes and further solidify your ser and estar knowledge, I am posting quite regularly now ser and estar quizzes on my YouTube shorts. So I've already got 2 posted now, and yeah, there should be more coming out in the future. So just go and watch those to just quickly have a little check to see where your level is at with ser and estar. And thank you very much for watching this video. and all the best with your Spanish learning, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Hasta la próxima. Adiós.